my life changed radically from that moment forward. The friends that I had quickly fell away, and I fell away from them. So for some reason, they didn't really want to hear about this God that had already done so much in my life, uh, and I couldn't get enough of this Jesus that I had met. And my family, my mom and dad, of course, had become Christians. I became a Christian, and we were frequently going to not just local church services at the Methodist Church, but there were other gatherings. There was something called the Charismatic Conference that was held once a year in Pittsburgh. A thing called the Ashram that was up in New Wilmington at the school up there, a college up there that we went to. And as the next few months passed, I witnessed and saw some incredible things. The Spirit of God was moving in a powerful way back then, as He does today. Just I don't see it quite on the level that I witnessed it back then. But there were some amazing, amazing things going on. And we go to this charismatic conference, and you saw people being healed, being delivered, being born again. Same thing at the ashram, and I'm witnessing people. Of course, I'm still on crutches, and here was kind of something funny that happened as things played out. I would go to these meetings, and full gospel businessmen, same thing. I mean, there were a number of them that we went to, but I'd crutch in, and of course, people would see me on crutches, and the first thing that many of them would want to do would be to pray for me, expecting that God would heal me, and they did. Frequently, people would come walking up to me, people I'd never seen before, asked to pray for me, and when they prayed for me, they'd pray. When they were done, they would look up, expecting me to walk off, and it just didn't happen. And quite honestly, it got awkward because I mean, they had great hearts and great intentions, and to be, again, quite honest, they did exactly what they should have done because they believed that our God could do and would do such things, and they acted on that. And I'm thankful for that. But for me, it got awkward because they would look up with such expectancy, and I didn't walk. And I got to where I felt like I was letting them down. And so I got to the point where I would try to avoid those kind of situations as much as I could. But another thing that we did is if any of you folks have ever heard of Catherine Coleman, what a woman of God. God used her in a mighty, mighty way. She's gone to be with Him, I don't know, probably 20 years ago now, I would guess. But again, what a woman of God. God's healing and deliverance poured out through this woman. And her home base was I think it was the First Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh, which is a large stone edifice, ornate, quite a building. And its sanctuary is big, and it's, for the most part, oval, except for the stage. It kind of comes out from there and goes around, wraps around. But I mean, it's big. The sanctuary is big, lots of seats, benches really, but wrapped around in kind of a semicircle. Twice I went down to Catherine Coleman's I was where I was. I was on crutches, and my leg was what it was. And I had continued to go to the doctors, like I said, probably about every 4 weeks, and nothing ever changed. The bone was just in pieces. It was what it was. So I went down to Catherine Coleman's with the hope that I would come out of that church not using my crutches anymore. And so I did. I went twice. I went down to Catherine Coleman's, and again, I saw things, witnessed things that you just can't explain it any other way. But to know that our God does what He does, heals, delivers, saves, it's just, it's miraculous. And but for me, at Catherine Coleman's, that just didn't happen. So I came out the way I went in on my crutches. Well, I'm going to fast forward here another few months and take us up into probably, mid-June of that year. It was early summer. And there was a baptismal service out at what used to be called Turner's Pond or Lake. It's not far from Keystone on a back road out there. And there were probably 20, 25 of us being baptized that day. And I was one of the last ones. And so whenever it was my turn to be baptized, I crutched in the lake in my clothes, and Dale Fife baptized me. I crutched out of the lake, and I'm crutching over to I had a van, and I was crutching over to my van to get some dry clothes to put on. When this woman that I had never seen before comes running up to me, and she says, "Do you know Jesus can heal your leg?" And I said, "Yeah, I know he can." And she said, "Well, let's pray." Well, as I mentioned before, I had gotten to the point where I tried the best I could to avoid these things. So I said to her, "Well, you know what? I've had lots of people pray for me," and I told her about the time that I had been able to walk months ago. And I'm trying to, the best I can, without being rude, I'm trying to kind of move away from her and kind of put things to rest. And so whenever I was done, she just looked at me and she said, "But you believe Jesus can heal your leg, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, I believe he can." And she looked at me and she said, "Jesus told me to tell you that you can walk now." And she said, "Let's take a walk." It's hard to explain. That night, in the hallway by the bathroom, our God, again, it wasn't audible, but it was powerful, and it was powerful inside me, told me to pick up my crutches and start walking. And as I mentioned, it would have been hard for me not to. It was that powerful. But now I've got this woman in front of me, a woman I've never seen before in my life, and I don't have that word from the Lord. There's nothing in me saying, "Pick up your crutches and start walking." I have this woman standing in front of me. And in my mind, I'm thinking, my leg's already really in bad shape. All I have to do is do something stupid, fall, and make it even worse. And yet I have this woman standing in front of me telling me that Jesus told her to tell me that I can walk now, and encouraging me to do exactly that. And I just kind of shook my head, and she looked at me again and she said, "But you believe, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "You believe Jesus can heal your leg?" And I said, "Yes." And again she said to me, "I'm telling you, Jesus told me to tell you that you can walk. Come on, let's take a walk." And again, I just shook my head, and I just wasn't there. And this conversation, it lasted probably 2, 3, 4 minutes, back and forth. This woman would not let me go. She just kept saying, "Did you believe?" I'd say, "Yeah." And she said, "I'm telling you, Jesus told me to tell you you can walk now. come on, let's take a walk. And back and forth it went, and back and forth it went until finally, after a few minutes, down went my crutches, and off we went. I'd never seen that woman before, and I've never seen her since. And I've thought about who that was. I think I know. Well, my mom and dad were at that baptismal service, and they saw me. They saw this woman. They witnessed it. They, as well as all the other people. But my mom and dad, quickly came up to me when I started walking, and we're standing there talking, and they, I told them what this woman said, and I'm walking now, and my mom looks at me and she said, Bruce, she said, you have an appointment with Dr. Swenson next week. And the whole purpose of that appointment was to schedule a bone graft for that part of my bone that just nothing was happening. And the last hope was to do a bone graft and hope that it took and was stable and stayed and functional. And so that was the whole the appointment I had the following week was just to set the parameters for that, the time, the date, that kind of thing. But that's what it was all about. And so my mom said to me, you've got this appointment with Dr. Swenson next week. What are you going to do? And I looked at my mom and I said, well, I'll tell you what I'm not going to do, Mom. I'm not going to just not show up. I said, this man, Dr. Swenson, has been good to me. So I'm going to go and tell him why I'm not coming back anymore. So that's what we did. The next week, my mom took me down to Dr. Swenson's office. And, a doctor, for you folks who are of my vintage, you remember how it was way back when. I mean, to see a doctor of that caliber, you had to wait in the waiting room for 2-3 hours, and then they shuffled you back into a back room and had to wait there for another half an hour, 45 minutes before you finally actually got to see the doctor that you were supposed to see at noon. Now it's 3 o'clock, and that's just how it was. And that's how it was that day. Mom and I went down, and we sat and waited in the waiting room, got put back in one of the back rooms, and finally, after a while, the door opened and in came Dr. Swenson. Fine man. And when he came in, I don't even know as he said hello to us. He was all business. He knew why I was there, why he was there. He knew what we were going to do. And so when he came in, he just started laying it all out. Okay, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is when we're going to do it. Yada, 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 yada. And he's going on and on and on. And finally, he made the mistake of taking a breath. And whenever he took a breath, I said, you know what, Doc? And he said, what's that? I said, the reason I'm here is to tell you why I'm not coming back anymore. And it was like the world just stopped. Time just stopped. And he was moving around and talking, and he just stopped. And that look that I gave Dale Fife that the night I met him in my mom and dad's living room, that's the same look he gave me, that same skeptical eye. He looked at me with that same eye, and he looked at me and he said, all right, what's going on? And so I told him what was going on. And again, his attitude, the way he looked at me, didn't change. He's still looking at me very skeptical. And he says, okay. He says, how about if you let me take an x-ray of that leg of yours? I said, okay. So they had an X-ray machine in the building we were in, so they wheeled me down to where the X-ray machine was, took an X-ray of my leg, and wheeled me back, and I'm sitting there in the room with my mom again. And back, of course, today when they take an X-ray, that's as soon as they take it, they can see it. Well, that's not how it was back then. It took probably a half an hour or so to develop the X-ray, and so we're sitting there, and finally, probably half an hour or so later, the door opens up, and in comes Dr. Swenson, and he's just, his head's kind of half hanging down, and he's shaking his head and shaking his head, and finally he looks up at me and he says, you know, faith is a wonderful thing. You've got all kind of new bone growth there that wasn't there before. That's the last time I saw Dr. Swenson. Until about 20 years later, a friend of mine who worked in the mines was in an accident and had the front part of his foot cut off in that accident, and he ended up down in Presbyterian Hospital. And I went down to visit him, and we're sitting there visiting, and I heard this voice coming down the hall. And as soon as I heard it, I knew who it was. And you can imagine what room he came into. Some things are meant to be. Yeah, it was Dr. Swenson, and came into that room, and we had a nice conversation, and that is the last time I saw him. But my life went on. Now I'm walking. I didn't use my crutch. I didn't need to use my crutches. And life's going on. I got married. We had kids. I worked. I had my own construction business. Built homes, framed homes for the better part of 10 years. But in my early 30s, I got a little sore opening on the inner aspect of what was left of my heel. Now my leg was ugly as heck. I mean, you can imagine my heels. I mean, it's not like my heel was there. It wasn't. Most of my calf was ripped off, and it was all convoluted. Didn't look pretty. But I developed a little sore on the inner aspect of my heel, and I was working for Prudential at the time, and I actually went out on FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, which protects your job if you have medical issues that you need to take some time off work. So I went off on FMLA, and I was off work for about 6 weeks until this thing healed up, and went back to work. I was fine. So for that 6 weeks, I was on crutches until that healed up. So from the time I was 18 until I was in my early 30s, yeah, I didn't use crutches, but I did until that healed up. Well, when I was about 50 years old, the same thing happened. I got another ulcer on the inner aspect of my heel, and again went off on FMLA, and this time it was about 12 weeks. It took FMLA. You have a maximum of 12 weeks per year to use that benefit without losing your job. And at the end of the 12 weeks, it had finally healed up, and I went back to work, and everything was good. And life's going on, you know. I mean, God's good. His grace is mighty. Not that I was always good to him. There's been times in my life where I haven't been very good to him at all, but he's always been good to me. And then when I was 55 years old, it happened again. I got another ulcer, and I went off on FMLA again. And at the end of the 12 weeks, it was almost healed, but not quite. And I had a choice. I could lose my job because they only protect you for 12 weeks, or I could go back to work and doctor with it just myself the best I could, and that's what I chose to do. And so for the next 2 years, I worked while I was trying to doctor with this wound. Well, over the next 2 years, it just gradually got worse and worse and worse to where it got pretty nasty. And so 2 years later, when I was about 57, I went off on FMLA, on crutches, and hoping that at the end of the 12 weeks I'd be able to go back to work and just continue with my life. Well, that didn't happen that way. At the end of the 12 weeks, it was probably, if anything, worse rather than better. And so I ended up losing my job, sent me into an early retirement, really, and but I'm battling to keep my leg. This wound is getting bigger and nastier. And over the next 2.5 years, I was on crutches, tried doing everything I could to keep from losing this leg. And I've thought about it, and nobody wants to lose a limb, an arm or a leg, nobody. But I think for me it was so much more personal than the average person because of all that had by the history, what that leg, how God had used that leg in my life, in other people's lives, and I just it was hard for me to think that this was God's will, that at the end of my life, late in my life, that the thing that He had used to bring me to Him and other people to Him and blessed others, that it was His will that I would lose that leg. And so I fought, and I fought hard as I could for 2.5 years. I doctored for the first roughly 14 months of that 2.5 years with a doctor down in Pittsburgh named Dr. Rusavich, who performed multiple surgeries, debridements on it, trying to clean it up and get the infection out of it. And I had 6 different types of bacteria in there. I had osteomyelitis, which is an infection of the bone, and they just couldn't get rid of it. I had a few times I had PICC lines in, peripherally inserted central catheters, where they put a line underneath your arm in your brachial vein and run it up right above your heart, and they feed all these the nastiest antibiotics you can figure they could come up with to try to kill this bacteria. It just wasn't. It just wasn't doing it. I had a wound vac, what's called a wound vac, on that a few different times over the course of the 2.5 years to try to draw that infection out and close the wound. I mean, they did anything and everything. And the first doctor, I had to be quite honest, wasn't the best. And ultimately, after 14 months, I switched and went to the doctor I kept from then on out. His name was Dane Wukish. Again, a great man, great doctor. But I remember the first time that I went to his office to see him. And again, it's the same thing. You sit in the waiting room, and then they take you back into another room, and finally he comes in. He comes in with his entourage, and of course I've never seen him before. He's never seen me. And they had me unwrap my leg, and so it was exposed. And so when he walked in, as he's walking past the bed towards me, he's looking intently at my leg, and when he came up to me, I don't even know as he introduced himself first, he just looked at me and said, "Did you ever think about having that thing amputated?" It's not exactly what I wanted to hear, and I looked at him and I said, "Well, Doc," I said, "you see those sticks over there leaning against the wall?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I've spent the last 14 months on those things, doing everything that I can to keep that from happening." And he said, "Okay, I'll do everything I can to help you." And he did. He did. So for the next roughly 14 months, he did exactly that. again, he performed a few different operations, debridements, just doing everything he could to reverse this and cause it to heal up. But it just simply wasn't working. It kept getting worse and worse. To the point where that wound that was on the inner aspect of what was left of my heel had wrapped its way around the back and was actually on the outer aspect now. It wrapped the whole way around the back part of what was left of my foot. And it was nasty. It was nasty. It was so nasty that lymph fluid would just drain wheat from it. And would wear these thick pads to catch the lymph fluid. And I'd have to change it twice a day because they would just get soaked. And this bacteria was just having a heyday in there. And there were times whenever I'd step out of the shower, I'd be drying myself off, and blood would just start squirting out of that wound across the floor. Not dripping, squirting. Arterioles would just break and start shooting blood. And something I want to say here is that I guess there was a part of me that was very selfish in all this, because it wasn't just me. My wife had to deal with all of this. She had to help me. There were many times that things needed carried that I couldn't carry, she carried. She helped me dress my wounds. She went to bed with me, a man that had 6 different types of bacteria in his heel. Not once did she complain. Not once did she say, I think I've had enough. You need to go have this taken care of. She did nothing but support me and did all that she could to encourage me and take care of me. I love this woman. How could you not? But anyway, after almost 2.5 years, that's the condition I was in, and it just progressively was getting worse and worse. And like I said, I just couldn't believe couldn't believe it was our God's will. And I fought, and I fought. Finally, one day, I was sitting in our family room, and by then I had been a Christian for probably close to over 40 years. And there had been just a handful of times when our God spoke to me. And this was one of them. And I'm sitting in our family room, and our God said to me, Bruce, are you greater than my servant Paul? In retrospect, when I think about that, I think for the average person, what does that mean? How can you make hide nor hair out of that statement? It's like, what do you mean? But for me, the amazing thing, the miraculous thing, wasn't just that our God spoke to me, but that as soon as he spoke to me, I knew exactly what he meant. And this is what he meant. If you're familiar with the Apostle Paul's story, you know that he was thrown in jail many times. Not because he did anything wrong, but just for preaching the gospel. He got thrown in jail. But our God always delivered him. And the next thing you know, he'd be out preaching the gospel again. It never slowed him down, never dissuaded him. They'd beat him. They stoned him one time, left him for dead. But next thing you know, he'd be back in the city, back in the synagogue, preaching the gospel. But God always delivered him. Every time, God always delivered him. And so it was with me in my leg. He allowed me to walk. And there have been a few times now where I had wounds that had opened, and he always delivered me. Always delivered me. But towards the end of Paul's life, Paul was thrown in the Roman jail. And God didn't deliver him. He died at the hands of Nero. And here I was towards the end of my life, after God had delivered me time and time again. And God said to me, "Are you better than my servant Paul?" I knew what he meant. There came a time, and now was my time. So with that, I picked up